now. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody.
Good morning.
Hi. Hi, Vivien, Marcelo. Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to all of you who've just joined this webinar. Very warm welcome to all our panelists and all of our attendees. We're just getting started now. I will just give people, I can see that people are joining, the numbers are going up very rapidly. So I'm going to just give everyone another couple of minutes to join, and then we will get started. And I will make the proper introductions and explain the format in a moment. But if everybody could remember, please, to just mute your microphones when you're not speaking. Those of you who've just joined as attendees in particular, you will see in the chat box, and my colleagues who are running the seminar, the webinar, you may need to put it in again. I'm not sure that people can see the chat that happened before they joined, so we're going to have to keep adding it. You will see a link to a Slido. Let me strongly encourage you to click on that link and just take a look quickly while you're waiting for the presentations to start. There is at the top bar, there is a Q&A tab, which is where you can put in questions for the panelists or any other comments that you have that you want us to raise. And then there's also a polls tab where we are looking, there is a quiz that you can do to test your knowledge of the WDR. And we're also looking for some, if you have stories or experiences to share, we're very keen to collect those so that, again, we can feed them back to the WR team. So please, while we're waiting, do just take a moment to take a look at that. If you're unable to access the Slido, you can also ask questions during the seminar by using the chat box under the Zoom link. So there are two options there, and I will be keeping an eye on both as we go through the webinar. Okay, colleagues, Karen or Alonso, I will wait for a signal from you to start and introduce myself and the panelists. Once again, welcome to all those who've just joined. Okay, good morning, afternoon, evening, take your pick. Welcome everybody. My name is Claire Melamed. I'm the CEO of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. We're absolutely thrilled to be helping to facilitate this consultation on the WDR with the World Bank. Thrilled for many reasons, partly because we are, of course, firm believers in consultation and the necessity of getting many different points of view and much input into important reports like this to produce the best possible product. And thrilled because the WDR is going to be on data for development, which of course is a subject very close to my heart, to all of you also, or you wouldn't be here. And particularly at the moment, I think, as the current global situation and the coronavirus pandemic is really bringing home to all of us the critical importance of good data to make good decisions, and the necessity all around the world of having data that properly reflects the experience, the situation, and the outcomes for everybody in order that policy can be made that benefits all of us. And of course, coronavirus is only the latest of a series of global challenges that really necessitate a global approach to addressing these many issues. On the one hand, of course, there are optimists about data and those who firmly believe that there is a brave new world opening up of technologies and potential. And on the other hand, of course, there are many who are very rightly also urging caution that with every new technology and new approach comes risks, and we have to be equally aware of the risks as the benefits as we step into this world. And I know, and all of you know from a close look at the concept note, that the World Bank report is very firmly trying to address both issues. And I think we are hoping today to cover both sides of the sort of optimist pessimist, perhaps that's the wrong characterization, to cover all sides of the debate. So the format today, as I said, we're first going to hear from the World Bank team, and I'll introduce them in a moment. Then we have some discussants lined up who are going to be giving their perspectives on the concept note and on what we've just heard from the presentation. Following which we'll go into a question and answer session. Now, in order to ask questions, as I just said, but some of you joined since then, we have two ways that you can ask questions. There is a link in the chat to a Slido, which is where you can ask questions. You can also indicate how important, you can indicate whether or not you want particular questions to be raised by liking questions that are posed by other people. That's quite important for me, because assuming that we get more questions than we're able to answer, that's going to give me a sense of really what's the burning issues on the group's mind. So it'd be very helpful if you do that. If you can't access the Slido, then please do ask questions in the chat. I'll be looking at both. So before I introduce the World Bank team, let me also particularly introduce Haishan Fu, who is the director of the Development Data Group at the World Bank and a long-time supporter, colleague and friend of mine. So thank you very much, Haishan, for being here. And we're excited to see this report going forward. Now, the team, I'm sure many of you already know the team at the bank who are leading on this report. We're really happy that I think everybody has joined us here today. So let me just, I'm not quite sure how you're going to be doing the presentation. I'm just going to introduce all of you and then hand over to whoever is going to be leading on your side to present. But let me just mention everybody. We're very happy to be welcomed by Bob Cull, Vivien Foster, Dean Joliffe, and Malarvizhi Veerappan, who between them constitute the co-directors and the manager of the group which is producing the report, which produced the concept note, and who will be distilling all of our discussion here today into the World Development Report. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining. Thank you. Really looking forward to an exciting and stimulating discussion. And let me now hand over to the World Bank team to just briefly talk us through the outlines of the report. Then we'll go into the discussants, and then we'll open up to everybody. Over to you. Okay, we seem to have a glitch. I'm not sure who is, Mala is having problems with the audio. Karen or Alonso, can we sort that out very quickly? And perhaps somebody else could lead off. Mala, are you back with us? Mala.
Claire, are you able to hear me? This is Bob Cull.
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
So I'll begin speaking, but we'll need, I'm sort of waiting for the presentation to queue up. So even if Malar can't speak to us, perhaps if she can get the presentation queued up, then we can get going right away, I guess.
Okay, I can see the screen sharing has just started, so there we go.
Okay. And so Malar, unless you come in now, I'm going to presume that your audio is not working, and then I'll just sort of take it from here. Okay, I see you're already moving us forward in the presentation. That's wonderful. So I will just take it off room. First, I did want to thank everyone for joining us. We eagerly await your comments. We're in early stages of this, we just got through the concept note review. And I'll just try to hit the high points here to give you a sense of what how we're trying to formulate these issues in case you didn't have much time to look at the concept note. So going through these slides quickly, these are things that we all know. There's been an explosion in data from 100 gigs per day, not long ago, less than 20 years, to 45,000 gigs per second in 2017. Many of the largest corporations in the world by market capitalization are now data-driven businesses. The majority of the top 10 years ago, only 2 of the top 10. So the point here, and let's go through this quickly, it's just there's been an explosion, a proliferation of data, which has coincided with rapid growth in the digital economy, and this has been led by the private sector. Next slide. But it's also equally obvious that the benefits of data and digital applications have not been shared equally. And so what we're trying to think about here is whether data can make a difference for the 700 million people who are in extreme poverty, mostly in rural areas, or the 900 million living without access to electricity. Still, even among somewhat better off people, 3.5 billion remain unconnected to the internet. And even among those who are connected, in low-income countries, those who are connected consume less than 1/3 as much data as those in high-income countries. So the benefits have clearly not been shared equally. And so, next slide. Unlike other reports on data in the digital economy, perhaps, our focus is going to be squarely, therefore, on how data can be used to improve the lives of the poor. So with respect to poor people, this is going to pose challenges because of their skill levels and familiarity with digital technologies, which limits their ability to understand the benefits and the risks of data. They also have low and irregular incomes, generally, which limits their ability to pay for devices and data services and makes it harder for them to connect. Many of the people that we're most concerned with reaching work in the informal sector. And so most of the transactions that they undertake are via cash or even barter. And so there's no real digital trail of their economic activity, and it potentially limits the penetration of digital transactions for them and their ability to share their data from their economic lives. On the positive side, many of the poor are young, and that may increase their receptivity to new technologies and enable a bit of a leap forward as we go into the future. When we're thinking about the challenges at the country level, many of our client countries have small economies, so that limits the scale of their data and sort of their attractiveness to these large platform business, data-driven platform businesses. But it also implies that they're likely to have limited negotiating power in international fora on all matters related to data. Many of these countries are also characterized by weak governance and institutions, and that may limit the complexity of regulatory and data governance approaches that are appropriate, and sort of trying to export approaches that are working in advanced economies may not work well. Many of these economies, third, are characterized by low productivity and small manufacturing sectors. Much of the evidence from advanced economies suggests that it's high productivity manufacturing firms that have been able to best adopt data-based innovations. And so that's another area where our client countries are at a disadvantage. And finally, these are high-risk environments, unstable, many of them, and that may be a contributor to limiting the attractiveness of investment, much needed investment in data infrastructure. So we recognize that in focusing the report on making data work for poor people and in poor countries, we're going to have a number of challenges that we want to keep in the back of our mind. In addition, we want to keep in the back of our mind a distinction between types of data. So next slide. And here we make a distinction between data originally collected for public versus private purposes, because each of them pose separate challenges. And this is a bit of a caricature because on the public intent side, we often think of survey-based approaches, but there are many types of data, administrative data, and we're moving into satellite data, and the report touches on all those. But if you'll bear with me for a second, the caricature here is that, on the public intent side, it's survey-based. it's supposed to be representative of the population. So these large surveys occur infrequently, and therefore there are lags in the timeliness of the data. But it is representative of the population. On the private intent side, these are data that were collected primarily for commercial purposes, not for development objectives. And therefore it's representative of digital users rather than the whole population. But on the very bright side, the feedback is potentially continuous, and the timeliness of the data is therefore instantaneous, potentially. And so throughout the report, what we're trying to think about is how we can bring these together, because in this sort of caricature slide, you can see that the strengths of the one type of data, the traditional public intent data, are sort of the weaknesses of the private intent data, and vice versa. And so throughout the report, a theme is trying to look for opportunities to create synergy between these two types of data. So recognizing those challenges in reaching the poor and the distinct challenges that public and private data, public and private intent data pose, we still feel that data holds promise for improving the lives of the poor. And the report is guided by a conceptual framework that points to 3 channels or pathways through which the benefits can occur. Next slide. So on the top, we see that providing more data to individuals in society can bring about greater transparency. That greater transparency enables monitoring of governments, and thus civil society individuals are able to hold governments accountable, producing better development outcomes. Through our middle pathway, there's more data on individuals that governments and international organizations are using, and that provides more evidence of policy impact, which can lead to better policy making and potentially better service delivery, therefore better development outcomes. And then finally, our third channel is data is itself a new factor of production, and it will work through data-driven businesses, private sector firms that use these data to innovate, and therefore there's a growth channel that could potentially lead to better development outcomes. You'll note that data reuse is also central to our theory of change here. So for example, data collected for commercial purposes could potentially be reused and repurposed to inform policy and to improve outcomes. And therefore the two-way dotted arrow between private firms and government is used to indicate reuse of private intent data by government for policy purposes. And since it's two-way, reuse of public intent data by firms to aid in innovation, growth, productivity. So reuse is central to our theory of change and our conceptual framework as well. We realize that data need not be only positively linked to development, and I think Claire quickly alluded to the risks and challenges. And so, we're aware that if misused, next slide, data can harm people, including the poor. And so, for example, through the middle pathway, when governments collect more data on individuals, they can monitor the population a bit too closely. Citizens' data can potentially be abused to rig elections or for politically motivated surveillance or to discriminate against segments of the population. And on the bottom channel, private firms could potentially abuse consumers' data through anti-competitive practices such as perfect price discrimination, algorithmic collusion. But also these data-driven platforms sort of lead to a level of market concentration that creates its own set of issues and makes us wonder about issues related to inequality and equity and the extent to which poor people and less developed countries will be able to reap the benefits of these new data-driven business models. So throughout the report, we're going to try to balance the positive gee whiz side, boy, there's so much that we could do with data to improve development outcomes, against these risks and challenges. So to this point in the simple framework, we sort of just assume that there are data that can be used to improve development outcomes. But the availability of those data is, of course, shaped by the environment in which they are created. And so now I'll hand off to my co-director, Dean Joliffe, to begin discussing factors that aid in the creation, collection, and sharing of data, while at the same time protecting data from misuse. Dean?
Great, thanks. I'm hoping my audio is coming through. Great, thank you. So this notion of context, next slide perhaps, this notion of context and environment as being central issues in how data can be better used to improve lives is really central to our storyline. it weaves its way through every topic that we're talking about in the report. So we'll be highlighting what features of a healthy data environment work to enable the use and reuse of data for the public good. And we'll also be talking about what safety measures are needed to prevent the misuse of that data. And an important distinction that we will be making, both in our conceptual framework and through this focus on enablers and safeguards, is that this report is going to be much more about just a call for more data. We'll be focusing on the systems that create the more effective use and reuse of data. So even in countries where data is abundant, it's frequently the case that the right data is not available for informing the current policy dialogue. This unavailability can be due to many different reasons. Sometimes just simple as the data sitting in one ministry but needs to be used by someone in civil society or needs to be used by a different ministry and there's no protocol in place for sharing. Or even in those cases where protocols exist on the books, the data may be just sitting on someone's laptop and not stored in a documented, organized data archive that is capable of being shared. So our focus on enabling environments is this idea that we need to help create environments which facilitate the use of data to solve many different problems. And we'll emphasize that as systems are improved and the data is more readily available for productive use, it also becomes more readily available for misuse. And we intend to articulate what safeguards need to be in place for preventing this. So next slide. To move this idea of enablers and safeguards forward a bit, we focus on two key attributes of data. First is that data can be used without using it up. So it's this non-rival good. Because it's non-rival, the impact that data can have is a function of how effectively it's been used in the past, but also how effectively it might be used in the future. And so in that way, the data of it, the value of data is really unknown because we don't know how it can be used in the future. And enabling that reuse of the data for future problems can mean simply ensuring that it flows to more users. So for example, within government, to researchers, to the public, but it also means that it's created in such a way that it can be more effectively and more easily overlaid with other data sources. So given that most policy issues are complex, multidimensional problems, it will frequently be the case that that the question is best answered by using multiple data sources laid over each other or merged together. But that issue then of using multiple data sources means that if you've effectively solved this issue of de-identifying the data in a single dimension, of protecting the data in a single dimension, that may become ineffective once it's overlaid with other data. And so that problem of creating and protecting data becomes significantly more complex as the data becomes effectively more interoperable with other data sources. A second attribute that we look at in the data systems is that data exhibit increasing returns to scale. So this has a couple of implications. One is that it suggests there's some minimum efficient scale, and some poor countries or low population countries may be operating well below this scale. And by this sort of minimum level of scale, we're not just talking about having a certain number of data points, we're really talking about the scale of the data system to use and reuse that data, so that it's important that we fill up gaps and that we fill up weak links in these data systems. At the other end of the spectrum, the increasing returns to scale means that there are incentives essentially encouraging the concentration of data, creating these potentially adverse effects through monopoly forces. And this can occur essentially because data is a fairly easily excludable good. And so those are, that's another factor that we need to safeguard against the creation of monopoly power in the use and ownership of those data sources. So next slide, please.
Dean,
So
Dean, if we can wrap this up in just sort of 2 or 3 minutes, just to make sure that we have time for everyone, for the questions and the discussion. Thank you.
Alrighty, so let me then, I'll trim this down to the bare minimum here. So this is just one illustrative example of how we're thinking about national data systems, just to try to give it a little bit more substance when we use this term. What we're trying to convey here, many things, I'll just mention two. The first is this notion that when we think about data for public policy and public intent data, we really mean to centralize it in the decision-making process. Also by putting in the center, what we are arguing is that the flow of data, even across ministries, has been ineffective in many of our counterpart countries. And this is really a key roadblock to improve public policy, so that we need to build these data systems that allow for the improved flow across ministries. Similarly, though, what we're trying to convey with these multiple lines here, the red dashed lines and the green lines, is that that data not only needs to flow across ministries, but it needs to flow to ultimately the owners of the data, so the public sectors, or the private sector side, the citizens, researchers, and journalists. But allowing that data, facilitating that flow of data out to the public also means that there need to be layers of data protection employed, so that people are protected in the use of that. And a bit of what we would talk about then is that with each step in sort of allowing the data to flow outwards, there's differential layers of security that need to be imposed, and that's a highly complex task. So this slide is just one illustration of how to think about a data system for the public policy. Vivien intends to talk about some of the more general attributes of safeguarding, the framework for thinking about coordinated way in getting data systems to work together through multiple channels. Vivien, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you, Vivien. Yeah, we're running a little bit short of time, so sorry, penalty for coming in at the end, but just a couple more minutes, please. Thank you so much.
Certainly, thanks. And I think I'll just use one slide. Malara, maybe we can just put up all the elements of the slide. So we'll be focusing on the environment for data creation and reuse, which is all around the enablers and safeguards that were mentioned earlier. The report will look at 4 pillars. The first is data infrastructure, which we see as the most basic or fundamental enabler of access to data. And we'll be concerned with 2 forms of inequity between people and inequity between countries. So inequity between people, we'll be looking at universal access to last mile data infrastructure, considering both supply side constraints, but also demand side barriers such as affordability and data literacy. Data inequity across countries, we'll be looking at data infrastructure, the fact that many poor countries actually rely almost exclusively on foreign infrastructure for data centers, cloud computing, even internet exchange points. We'll be looking at the economics of developing data infrastructure domestically for poor countries. The second pillar is laws and regulations. We'll be looking at the legal enablers such as transparency, interoperability, portability, as well as safeguards, where we'll be distinguishing between personal data with a human rights-based approach, and non-personal data where we'll be thinking more in terms of intellectual property rights. The legal and regulatory discussion will distinguish between those laws that apply at the national level and procedures for enabling and safeguarding cross-border data flows. Under economic policy, we'll be looking at how decisions on data regulation have knock-on effects for the real economy in 3 areas. One is competition policy and the issues around concentration of market power. The second is international trade and the way in which data protection measures taken domestically may create concerns about protectionism in the international environment. And thirdly, we'll be looking at the challenges of taxing data-driven businesses, which often have a market presence without physical presence and have the ability to shift profits across borders in ways that undermine domestic revenue mobilization. And we'll be looking at the cross-border spillovers and the need for international policy coordination in each of these areas. Finally, we'll be looking at institutions and governance, and we'll be thinking about what kind of institutions are needed to fulfill all of these enabling and safeguard functions. To what extent do we need to repurpose existing institutions, such as national statistical agencies, or create new institutional actors like data protection authorities? We'll recognize that there's no single institutional model, and that the institutional design needs to reflect the maturity of governance more generally across the economy in the context of a multi-stakeholder approach. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much to all of you. That was incredibly interesting. I'm assuming that we'll be able to make this presentation available to everybody after or after the webinar, so that the slides that you didn't have time to show, people will be able to have a look at. Thank you so much. So just before I turn over to the discussants, to give you a flavour of the questions, just so that you know what people are most interested in, there is a cluster of questions which are really focusing on the kind of the sort of underlying premise here. There's questions about the terminology. Could we have something perhaps a little bit more sophisticated than just characterizing kind of poor and rich countries, and something which actually kind of recognizes different levels of development within those two categories, and also a recognition that there are some aspects of the digital economy, for example, mobile money, where those countries that we might think of as poor actually arguably have been adopting new technologies faster than many of the countries that we would think of as rich. So can we sort of address some of those things? There's a strong interest here in ethics and inequality, partly in the collection of data, but also about, as you've already raised, the risks of some of these new developments reinforcing or providing new mechanisms for reinforcing inequalities. And then a very specific question on data on marginalized groups, and the assumption that data can lead to improvements in service delivery obviously relies quite strongly on the idea that you have the right data about people who use those services, and relies quite heavily on the assumptions of on the sort of disaggregation of data and so on. So questions about how that is addressed. So that gives you a flavour. The questions are coming in thick and fast, so please continue to do that, and it's very helpful to me to vote on those questions that you see posed by others that you find particularly interesting. Gives me a clue as to which ones to put at the top of the discussion. But let me now turn over to the discussants with those questions in mind and the thoughts that you came in with as you read the report and listened to the presentation. We're very happy to have three people here from very different perspectives and parts of the world who can help to frame this conversation and provide their perspective. So the first, I'd like to introduce first Kieran Sharpie-Schaefer, who is a managing partner of Palindrome Data. And I think speaking to us from South Africa, is that right? Kieran, over to you.
Hi Claire, yes, thanks very much. Yeah, I'm in Cape Town in South Africa. I'm from Palindrome Data. We have a small data science company here, working mostly in the HIV sector. We're trying to take private sector techniques in machine learning and risk scoring and bring that into services like health, and particularly HIV and TB, to try and use these techniques that have been used for over 20 years in banking in other sectors, and try and get that impact into the health sector. And if Claire, if you were asking me to pass comments on the report, I mean, I think my quick thoughts is that I do like the report in terms of it's trying to paint this picture of the combination of private sector and public data as a combination to kind of improve services. And that's really what we've seen, that development and public health development particularly has been quite far behind in its technique, only looking at demographics in terms of age and gender, trying to decide how are those two factors affecting outcomes. Whereas a more modern approach is to take broader picture of the population. So including economics, including personal behavior, including personal attitudes, and how those things actually affect in such a large degree people's uptake of health services and such things. So that part of the report makes a lot of sense to me. I think something you were just mentioning there, though, is that there's a danger with these reports that they can become a little bit focused on like a DC perspective of the world, talking about poor countries and all that kind of thing. I think that was a really good point you just highlighted from the questions, because you've got to build these reports and these policies from the bottom up. These countries that you're talking about have huge amounts of innovation that are being adopted, and a huge amounts of their services they skipped paper, they went straight to digital, and a huge amounts of their populations are engaging on things like Facebook and digital in different ways. So I do worry sometimes if these reports always end up being this kind of like US or DC based view of the world, and constantly thinking about risks and stuff that are generated from a Western or again a DC based view of things. Because those problems that are listed in that report, those problems exist in England and America. They don't just exist in developing regions. But the developing regions might have more unique or more specific or more top of mind challenges that need to be addressed. So sometimes get a little bit confused with these things, whether the process is top down or bottom up. So I'm not sure how much of that you caught and if it was a little fast, but let me know if that was a helpful statement.
Thank you, Kieran. I have one follow-up from that, which is just thinking about your experience of actually of kind of running programs and trying to actually kind of apply data to solve very specific issues, as you say, in relation to health. Is there anything that's missing from the current framework? Are there any issues that you've addressed in your work, or things that kind of problems that you've had to work through, challenges that you feel are not represented? And I guess the other way, are there any things that are highlighted in the report that you don't actually think are particularly big issues?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think, you know, the one thing, and it's hard to know how to reflect in the report, is something about people becoming more comfortable with different sources of data. Like at the moment, for one example is, you know, we worked a little bit in Eswatini and some other places, but, you know, you could get sources of data like, where is the GPS coordinates of these health facilities? And the government often only relied on its own internal sources. Meanwhile, we could query on Google API, Google Maps, give me all the facilities in Eswatini, all the clinics, and get a huge amount of data, publicly available data from Google. But there's a suspicion of this approach of taking a third-party source of data. And you know, what would be best practice, and it's certainly what Starbucks and Coca-Cola and everyone else do, is they take different sources of data and then try and triangulate a truth. And that process of triangulation is kind of a discussion that even the academic world in public health isn't really comfortable with, and the government certainly weren't comfortable with. So, you know, I'm not saying that it has to be a huge part of the report, but we're still struggling with, like, how do we broach these discussions of folks being open to different sources of data to get a more precise version of what the truth is. Does that answer the question, Claire?
Thank you. No, that's incredibly clear. And actually that's a, yeah, that's a really, really important point. And actually one that I'm also going to invite our next speaker to address, Lisa Bersales, who is currently a professor of statistics at the University of the Philippines, but was previously the head of the National Statistics Office in the Philippines, and as such led some, you know, amazing processes of innovation and modernization of statistics, and I'm sure faced that exact issue around how to increase the comfort levels and the trust of policymakers, the users of the data, in some of these different sources and in the kind of the practice of triangulation. So Lisa, let me warmly and thank you very much for being with us today, and invite you to, I know you've got some other thoughts that you wanted to share with us, but anything that you can shed light on that important point would be great. Thank you. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Claire. You know, I would like to focus first on what made me really interested when I started reading the concept note. And this was the quote in the beginning of the concept note of a statement by Carly Fiorina, the former president and chair of Hewlett-Packard Company. And the quote is this: the goal is to turn data into information and information into insight. For me, this is the bottom line, really, for data that we need for addressing better lives, specifically better lives for the poor. So that's where I'm coming from. And then when I read through the concept note, many of the specific discussions that resonated with me, and I hope you don't mind before I really talk about my experience sharing with you as you requested, just want to list all of those that really find me excited about what could come out of the final product of the World Development Report 2021. First, of course, the framework with the 3 pathways. Next is the data life cycle with a clear discussion of reuse of data and protection. I think this discussion of reuse of data should continue to be really highlighted in the report. But I would like to also thank that we are not saying that we want more data. what we're saying is we're looking for the right data, and maybe they are there. So we just need in the report to help countries really look for those right data. Now, the discussion on public intent data and private intent data really is very important, and I appreciate that there are classifications. There are some data that may not be classified in any of those two. So they are like the citizen-generated data, which are collected by private, usually CSOs, but they're really for public good. They are the voice of the people, really. So there are many countries where the civil society organizations are very active with really good voices representing the poor, and we should really listen to them. Now, I really love the discussion on enablers and safeguards. And for me, all of this will come together in the discussion on data governance with all of the data stewardship, data curation. And I really appreciate that in the concept note, there is reference to the past World Development Reports. It gives me a sense of comfort that the World Bank are not making development reports by themselves. They are moving to better and better development reports. So I really appreciate that there is a discussion of learnings. Now, I also appreciate that there is mention of some other groups and partnerships which are being considered. And I hope you mind, with the Global Partnership for Stable Development Data, Paris 21, Trends of SDSN, and Open Data Watch, they have all excellent reports already. So, focus now to answer really Claire saying what were some of my experiences regarding, you know, having a statistical system that is really very innovative. I would like to react on the proposal of the unified national data system, a one national data system. And I like the discussion there that there will be a maturity model approach, because for some systems we have to be very simple first. And it's for me, maybe it's a matter of coordination and having data hubs. There should be no one data hub, but federated ones. So there is the important note that there should be an agency that should orchestrate all of this, so that there are standards. Quality assurance is very important, but please don't forget administrative data as well, even as we're very open to web scraping, mobile data. In my mind, they will address the granularity issue. Granularity issue really will be addressed by the private intent data. And this is where citizen-generated data, mobile. Remember, please, the poor are on the ground. They are in villages. They are not in the national statistics or indicators, the macroeconomic statistics. They are on the ground. So we have to have more granular subnational data. Private intent data, in my mind, is the way to go. I have so many other thoughts, but I think this is it for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Really helpful as always. Particular question, you mentioned particularly the kind of idea of a centralized national data system. There's been a few questions that have come up in the chat about, you know, urging a little bit, I'm sensing a little bit of caution from the audience about the idea of a national data system. Somebody, you know, inviting reflection on the harm of centralized data systems and referencing Aadhaar in India. And then, you know, someone else questioning whether there are kind of good models, or at least a proposal for how the architecture of a centralized system might work to reconcile the enablers and safeguards. So I don't know whether, sort of from your perspective, you have any specific comments on that idea of a kind of single system, of a national data system.
Thank you, Claire. As I've said, in my experience, maybe data hubs, federated data hubs will work, where the different owners of the data keep their data. But there is interoperability and agreement for ready access if needed, but also the protection of individual level information. Then we have to take care of the private intent data, because the existing government agencies have their own data hubs already. So for me, what is important there is to maintain quality assurance. We need to teach all of these ministries quality assurance. On the private intent data, then maybe we can have some other data hub for them. But as I've said earlier, they are actually needed, in my experience, when we go granular. So this is coordination, openness, talking to each other is really very important. And in my experience, you have to have the champions that will, and the influencers there, specific people within countries to, make this very good enabling environment for such an open discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So in that model, sort of interoperability and the common standards that can drive interoperability become much more important levers for change than centralization and the creation of a sort of common infrastructure. And I think that is, I've seen that in other cases, there's somewhat sort of two models emerging of how one would create these systems. They're not totally mutually exclusive, but I think they imply different kind of focus on different areas. Lisa, and then I want to hand over to Aidan.
Yes, but Claire, I just want to say there is no model that will fit all. So there's no
totally.
So each country will just have to talk among themselves and decide how they will do this. Always bottom line, data becomes information, information becomes insight. I really love that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And I guess one contribution that this report could make would be a look across different systems that are actually in operation across the world and trying to create for us a sense of the diversity and the different choices the countries have made and some of the consequences of those choices. Right. Before we dig into that, let me now hand over to Aidan Kuze, who I'm sure is known to many of you, the Executive Director of TWAWEZA in Tanzania, also a board member of the Global Partnership. Aidan, there are lots of questions that have come up on the various different chat channels that we're using. I've got 3 windows open here around citizen-generated data. A question here about how we define the right data, and whether who generates the data is actually one of our considerations in thinking about the kind of quality and value of that data. And lots of other questions about, as you heard, about data disaggregation, representation, and really making sure that we are properly reflecting in different ways the views of those most marginalized people who, as we've heard, are the sort of focus of this report. And then, of course, you yourself have posed a number of questions, which I'm hoping that you will answer for us, about power, profits, and inequality, which I think are absolutely critical here. So, Aidan, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Can you all hear me? I hope you can hear me. If you can hear me, just thumbs up. The other thing is, maybe those of you who are looking at participants, you might be multiple Aidan Kuzes. Those are, I think, are my colleagues. I shared with them my login details, so I think they're on there. Or of course, if you are a conspiracy theorist, I have cloned myself and I am bombing this Zoom chat. But I want to start off on where Lisa left, and then I want to really underline what Kiran said. So that's a good thing of coming next. I completely agree. Data, with Fiorina's statement, data, it turns into information, information into insight. I will add one more thing. After insight, I think we'd get imagination. How can we create a better world in order to live with this, to really put the accent under the title of the report, Data for Better Lives. So really, with insight, hopefully it can catalyze some of our own imagination as to how to best make use of this data. So I want to take this sort of slightly helicopter view or philosophical view. I really liked, Dean, I think the presentation of that framework for the organization, but it made me nervous in one area. It starts with data, but data is generated by people. I think for me, that is what is missing in this conceptualization. It really is about human beings, and we generate the data, maybe for utilitarian purposes or for insight or for imagination. But really, I would put in that box, not data, but people. We are the actors and the principals for which all of this is happening. In the second set, civil society, you put / individuals. I think civil society, government, and firms are how we organize ourselves. We are the agents for the wishes and the proclivities and the aspirations of the people who generate the data. So I really want to anthropomorphize this whole report and put people at the center. And at the end, of course, if development is the outcome, it really is development of people. It's not development of infrastructure, of whatever, it's really about development and better lives of actual human beings. So I would really ask the team to, when conceptualizing, writing, thinking, tone, really to put it in that framework. Put people at the center of the thinking around the report and the recommendations that are there. The other one that I think was raised a little bit by Lisa, the other thing that made me nervous, sorry, I'm telling you about things that are making me nervous, is actually the sort of the centralized national data system. Even in the conceptualization of that slide, they're in the center, a very centralized framework. And that makes me quite nervous, because if we're saying, for example, the national statistics officers are the ones who are to have some kind of coordination or even gatekeeper role, then there's a lot that can go terribly wrong there, in the sense that of people being excluded, certain views or populations or granularity being excluded because it is inconvenient or because it is expedient for the central authority or centralized authorities to exclude particular information, particular insight, and therefore dampen certain people's imagination and creativity as to improving their own better lives. I really would like us to take a very careful look at the risks, at least highlight the risks of the centralized data, national data system, to coordinate or to be a gatekeeper on the inclusivity of the whole process of making data give economic value to most people. The third thing I want to mention, maybe related to the second, is that there is a certain tacit assumption in the conceptualization, the concept note, that it is quite government-centric, and importantly, that government is a neutral arbiter between competing social interests and groups. My experience in Tanzania, I'll be quite frank with you, it is not. It is far from being a neutral arbiter of independent or competing interests. It is a major player. They create the rules, and they can tell you this yes and this no. I am living this every single day. So please, let us not take that view. Let us really understand that if we're going to talk about the role of government, let's think about it with those particular potentialities in mind and the downside risks that those build. Can we therefore imagine a more distributed system of governing the data space, of assuring digital rights, of assuring a digital governance framework that is inclusive rather than provides all the power to government? The same way we get nervous about market power of digital companies, we should get very, very nervous indeed about the policy power of government. And I'll finish with maybe trying to address the point you make there, Claire, in terms of triangulating citizen-generated data. And I just love what Kieran said, and I think he was being diplomatic and you know, a bit modest. I think it is absolutely vital. Where a lot of insight is coming from these days is actually from the triangulation of data by non-state actors. You know, I have, for example, been talking to somebody, met them on Twitter just a week, about using the search terms "I can't smell" to understand what the COVID-19 trajectory in Tanzania could potentially be. Just using that and using Google search, using very clever algorithms and giving, at least sharing with me, numbers which are way different from what the government is officially reporting, because the government finds it inconvenient to test and to report and to be transparent about COVID-19 in Tanzania. And so this triangulation is helping me and my colleagues in civil society understand better what might be the COVID-19 infection rates in the country, and how does one then communicate to that population as an alternative voice how to protect themselves here. So that is clearly a way of using triangulation and citizen-generated data to actually have important very current initiatives and approaches to helping people save their own lives under this current pandemic. I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Aidan. Really, really helpful insights. And I think that this point that you raise about the sort of politics of this and the fact that government is not a neutral, or at least cannot be assumed to be a neutral arbiter, and that we can't simply posit data as this kind of abstract technical question, that it's highly, highly political, is certainly one that's resonating with a lot of people on the chat. And this whole question about gatekeepers, you know, who are the gatekeepers? When we talk about triangulation, what exactly do we mean? Who gets to decide about what is triangulated and what we see as being kind of acceptable? So I'd like, there's some other really, really interesting questions that have come up in the last few minutes that I definitely want to get to, but let me first turn this politics question over to the team. And I guess, yeah, I do want to get in as many questions as we can. So in this next phase, if just perhaps one person can from the bank side can address each point, and then if others want to pitch in, please do so on the chat, unless there are strong differences of opinion between you, which of course we'd be fascinated to hear. But anyway, yeah, so I think this whole point about sort of politics and governance and how you're going to incorporate a political analysis into this national data system idea is clearly really important. So great if somebody could respond to that.
I can take I suppose, a first crack at some of these, some of the feedback on this idea of the national data systems that we've presented in the concept note in this slide. I think the first and probably the most important thing is just to emphasize that that slide is really meant to illustrate one potential candidate way of thinking about a data system, and I think the views of the report will probably align with a lot of the language that Lisa was using about certainly not one size fits all. There are lots of different sort of potential solutions to it. But having said that, I do think it's important that we're, you know, sometimes when you start saying that one size fits all, you sort of become so ambiguous and vague that you're not giving clear sort of guidance. And we don't want to make that mistake. So we want to be very clear that there's certain attributes that are incredibly important in these national data systems, and that we see as sort of weaknesses of many of the national data systems. And that really is the improved flow of data out, you know, within the government, but outside to the government, to citizens. And we think that's a really important attribute that needs to be established in these national data systems. And if that's through federated data hubs, that's an excellent sort of potential model. In some countries, it could potentially be this centralized data system, but that slide really is just meant to illustrate this notion of putting data more central to decision-making process. On this comment about bringing in the humanity, I mean, that is the critique that we're continuing to levy on ourselves, is that whenever we're talking about things, we're always sort of posing, where's the human person behind this? And so that is a continual challenge to us, to ensure that we're always talking about people, and in fact, viewing data in many ways as a structured communication between you know, the collectors and the people providing the data. And so using that communication effectively to understand people's needs and desires is really an important part of that system. I do want to say this notion about thinking about the government as sort of the gatekeeper on data. And in fact, a lot of the data system is meant to be preventing that a lot of what's happening in, I think a lot of the reason why data systems fail is that it's an effective way of preventing people from getting access to data, to have a failed data system. And that's probably the most effective way in which governments prevent people from getting access to data. And we think that's really an important sort of obstacle to work against. And so when we think about the importance of this data system, is that it has to create the flows to academics. It has to create flows of data to civil society, and it has to create flows of data to citizens. And that's the most important aspect. Similarly, this question about this sort of put in this phrase of triangulation, we do think that a lot of the important sort of innovations and a lot of the certain potential steps forward in using data for insight and better policy is going to be coming with on some of the research side of better use of methods and combining different data sources. What we're talking about there is triangulation and this overlay of different sort of pieces of information to get closer to truth. Some of that can and should be done in government, but at the same time, a lot of it is most effectively done by researchers or civil society organizations, and it's done best when it also has access to public intent data, to public policy data. And so to do this sort of triangulation effectively, those data sources are best served if they include a lot of the public policy data for particular ground truthing to address some of the key central issues and shortcomings of a lot of the sort of citizen-generated data or private intent data produced. Why don't I stop there? Because it is incredibly useful for us to hear all of this feedback, incredibly helpful and insightful. I'm not sure, Bob or Vivien, if you want to jump in.
Thank you, Dean. Before I invite Bob or Vivien to jump in, I just want to come back to Aidan. I mean, you posed the issue about the fact of government as a kind of actor here and not a neutral referee. What would you like to see, or what would be the areas that you would suggest the team look at in terms of possible kind of ways to approach the politics of data in relation to governments that sort of choose to act as players here rather than as referees?
Okay, I think that great question, good point. Maybe I'd best answer that question by giving an example of what we are already doing in Tanzania around data and what we've done as Traweza in the last few years on education. So we were able to have a massive effort of collecting independent citizen-generated data on whether kids were learning when they were in school. And we discovered that there was quite a lot of many kids were actually in school but not actually learning basic skills, and this has influenced some public policy in the countries where we work, in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. But I want to focus in on a specific example of what do you do about it. We've been running an experiment now going on for 6 years on whether providing teachers with a promise of a cash on delivery at the end of the school year, if they teach their kids to meet minimum standards, would actually raise the learning outcomes. And we found that, yes, that is indeed the case. That promise raises learning outcomes by about 30%. Across the board in the schools that we looked at. And this was consistent over a number of years. But the data generation piece there is what I think is interesting, and how maybe begin to answer the question. Here we are as an independent civil society organization using the best randomized controlled trial thinking and measuring, etc. But we are in collaboration with the government itself. They're observing us collect this data, run this experiment, and understand what the learning outcomes are. So the data is not being generated by the government office, or nor are they gatekeepers. But here we are as a technical player in this, as an implementer of this particular initiative. And then the data is fully transparent to them, how it's collected, how it's analyzed, how it is interpreted in terms of outcomes. And we've published that we're doing this even in the QJE last year for the first round of experiment. So what I'm trying to say here, there is an element here, I think Lisa, or maybe somebody was quoting a chat box about how do you have sort of federated data systems. This is how, one example, you can actually have these, I suppose, partnerships between civil society, between private sector and government itself, where the private sector, so there are outcomes and it is understood, it's fully transparent to the government, and so therefore there is much less nervousness on all sides as to the veracity of the data that is produced. But if it's done by government alone and it's opaque, it's inside a black box, we're not sure at all that this is going to achieve what we need to achieve, and that is making lives better for people.
Thank you, Aidan. Lisa had a good point that she wants to make on this. Lisa, to you.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you, Aidan and Kieran, for your comment about government. I would like to be controversial here. What do you refer to when you refer to government? Because in my mind, we should really talk about the National Statistics Office. We have to accept that by law, the mandate for public intent data production is given to NSOs. So I really like what this concept note of World Bank says. There's a part there which says that the World Bank Group continues to support strengthening statistical capacity in countries. I believe that if we strengthen NSOs, the way it is envisioned by the UN Statistical Commission with the UN Fundamental Principles of Official Statistics, you will have some sort of neutrality, transparency, and independence. Why? Because part of this transparency, neutrality, independence is for the NSOs to talk to all stakeholders and to get their inputs and to be willing for their data to be vetted, especially by academics, researchers, and civil society. So this is where I am coming from. Government, there are many of them. And some branches of government are really very political. I would like to point out that the statistics offices are supposed to be apolitical. But of course, in reality, it's difficult. You know, even if you try to be neutral and apolitical, there will always be attempts to, you know, try to influence you. And this is why it is important for the NSOs to be transparent so that civil society will help defend them for any interventions. I hope you don't mind, I will share my experience as the chief statistician of the Philippines. It is difficult to, you know, defend the Philippine Statistics Authority then, because it's like, you know, you're defending yourself. But if you are transparent and you ask academicians, researchers to vet your data, they are the ones who will defend what the data are, but they will also be the staunch critics of the data that are collected. So I just want to put that on the table for further discussion maybe, but I totally agree that with the SDGs and with now COVID-19, we have to put everyone around the table. It cannot be just government and the NSO, you know, deciding on data. That's why I totally agree with the private intent discussion of the concept note. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. That's really important. And we had a good demonstration yesterday in this country, in the UK, of the importance of an independent statistics office, where the National Statistics Authority sent a very strongly worded letter to the government criticising their use of data on the way in which they were counting the number of COVID tests that were done. Okay, I'm going to invite Kieran wanted to come in on this point, I think, and then we've only got 20 more minutes left. The time has flown. So there are two other issues that are very high in people's minds that I would like to address once Kieran's spoken. One is this question of inequality. There's a number of quite different dimensions of inequality that have been raised, but I'm going to try to just address a single question on that to the bank team. And then there's a lot of points with something which we absolutely have to put at the center of this discussion, which is about data use and the way in which data can influence policy and outcomes. So just for the bank team in particular, that's what's coming. But Kieran, over to you now. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks and for letting me jump in. And sorry, Aidan, if I jumped in before you there. But yeah, no, Lisa's got a good point about the role of the National Statistics Office. The concern about gatekeeping was coming that the data sources themselves don't need to be necessarily only and always inside of that government's quote unquote infrastructure. The National Statistics Office is so important. You know, it's there to analyze different data sources from different providers, maybe academia, maybe private sector, maybe some other source, maybe agents and group themselves, this kind of thing. And then the statisticians need the skills and the capacity to analyze these different pieces of research that have been done and then communicate to government and the citizens. This is what we think is the state of play from our meta study of the different situations, and then allow their political leaders to then make decisions on that. Too many times we do go to places in the region where I live, you know, sub-Saharan Africa, specifically SADC, where the bank is talking to governments about investing in a data center inside the statistics office, which doesn't make quite as much sense. For instance, in South Africa, if they're looking at mobility during COVID and they're trying to understand, are people adhering to lockdown or are they moving around? Should the statistics office or the health department go out and survey people? Or should they just call up the operators and ask them, can you give us an anonymized data set or some evidence about whether people are adhering to the lockdown or not? Because the operators, there's no one better than the mobile operator to explain that to you. And in South Africa, they actually put that into law that the operators have to deal with the government in this COVID emergency. And that makes sense. The difference between data source owners and controllers of the data and data analyzers and processors, which could be the statistics office. So there's that difference between data infrastructure and data skills. The government completely needs to be data literate, whether it needs to spend billions of dollars repeating some infrastructure that already exists in both the civil society sector and the private sector. Just seems hard to get your head around that kind of logic. And that is the concern I think I certainly was trying to articulate around gatekeeping, where these investments come from overseas, and then it kind of goes towards a server under someone's desk somewhere in some ministry. And that seems always a pity when folks have already built these data sets.
Thank you, Kieran. I think this is obviously a report that comes from the bank will be taken as a signal around the priorities for development financing and spending. So obviously, I think that in particular is a really important point to drive home. Okay, we are at 15 minutes from the end, and I'm sure all of you have many other Zoom calls to attend today, so we can't go a minute over. There are two other very important issues that we regret won't have time to cover in quite this amount of depth, so my apologies for that. One is about inequality, has come up in several of the comments on the chat. Now, I think there are two particular dimensions of inequality here, which to my mind are slightly different, but I'm going to run them together and invite a response. One is inequalities in data collection. This is one of the questions that is of most interest to people on the Slido, and about the sort of ethics and the given power inequalities between those who are collecting the data and those who are answering the questions, in a sense, whose experience is the subject of the data. So how can the actual process of collecting data sort of, I guess, be used to somewhat mitigate those inequalities, or at least take account of that in order to reduce errors and to try to produce the information that can help in order to make that relationship between the data collector and the subject of the data as sort of equal as possible. And then, of course, there's the whole question on data and whether these new systems and technologies are going to reinforce or worsen existing inequalities, or whether they can in themselves be a dimension of reducing inequality. I think there's quite a lot of debate around the ways in which we can set in place safeguards so that new technologies can at least not increase inequalities. Are there any ways that you're seeing in which the use of new technologies and the improved use of data can actually reduce inequalities, and data can itself be a force for reducing inequalities? So there's a lot of quite different issues there, and my apologies for that, but just in the interest of getting everything out on the table, let me invite somebody from the bank team to come back on those big questions. Who wants to go? Don't be shy.
It's always tough for us to coordinate here. We're trying to, this is Bob, and I will come in. I want to pick up on a number of themes that were brought. I don't know that I'm going to get quite to the inequality as well, so maybe I will leave that Vivien if she wants to come in later on that, except to say that, you know, there are technologies that we're thinking about that directly can contribute to reduced inequality. And this harkens back to, you know, things that you said at the very beginning, Claire, about how, you know, we had a sort of, in the conceptual framework and the overview that we gave, we couldn't give much nuance. And so this sort of poor country, rich country is too coarse a distinction, and there's much going on. So there are areas that we want to emphasize in the report that, for example, digital financial services is going to be one that's emphasized, where a data-driven business model is used to promote financial inclusion. It comes with risks and challenges, but so we want to highlight some examples that will reduce inequality. But I wanted to go back, if I can, for a second, to a number of things that the other panelists have said. Where Kieran was talking about, you know, it's not that the government needs to set up its own set of collecting in-house data, but they need capacity. They need to be able to use it. The government needs to be data literate. And it all comes down to trust and capability, which we totally agree with, and it's a theme that we want to explore within the report. And I've only been part of a couple of these, Dean's been part of more, but we've been talking to national statistics offices. And it's clear from what I've sat in on that what Lisa was talking about you need to, we want the NSO to be apolitical, which is an ongoing challenge. And so that's we want it to be, we want transparency, neutrality, and independence. I think that all goes back to trust, and the public having the trust in the capabilities of the NSO and the government more broadly to be able to use these data sources. And so that'll be a theme that we're very sensitive to, we want to generate, and we want to speak about throughout the report. And so it's not governments at the center. I agree with, you know, what Aidan was saying about at best, it's governments in collaboration with external providers of data. And your education example was great. I mean, it's very much in line with one of our WDR topics from a couple of years back, the learning crisis. And so that was a really nice collaborative example of how your group, in full transparency with the government running the RCT, can show how to improve educational outcomes. So that's a collaborative side, but also to harken back to what Aidan said, you know, political economy is lurking throughout, you know, challenges here about what's collected and shared will be treated throughout the report, and that the, you know, amassing data is amassing power, and it's all in the hands of the government. This is something to be concerned about. And so political economy, sometimes it's not going to all be collaborative. It's going to be other data sources that are sort of shining a light on how government, and I mean government here distinct from the NSO, is formulating a policy, or what information it's using and sharing. So for example, I think of like in Latin America, the Billion Prices Project, where retail academics and other researchers pulled together tons of information on retail pricing to show that national government statistics, some of the basic ones on inflation and consumption, were biased in certain ways. I think sometimes it's not going to be a partnership in the way the example that Aidan highlighted. It's going to be shining light and more adversarial. But I think in our conceptual framework, we need all of these things to work together. And so I'm sort of rambling, but thank you all. I'm trying to tie things together, and I'm making things more disparate. Sorry, but these comments are so helpful to us. We couldn't appreciate them more. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. That's incredibly helpful. Okay, so I want to, I'm not sure we've quite got to the inequality point, but time is moving on. So I'm going to pose the sort of what I think is the last set of questions, that sort of big set of issues that arose from the questions, and perhaps if somebody wants to have a go at that, and also if there are remaining things to be said on inequality, then please come back to that too. I mean, I think the final issue that people, that seems to be kind of quite a big topic raised on the chat is about data use. Somebody made the good, Ingmar, you've made the very good point. I'm going to read this out in full. Climate change serves as a sobering example of how it's not the lack of data or insights that keeps us from taking action. So how do we tackle the issue of data communication and data use, and actually rather than passively taking this report as a sort of, let's make the data available, put it down on the pavement and hope that somebody picks it up. How can we actually, as part of constructing a good data system, increase the incentives for data use, not just the ease, but actually the sort of active expectation and incentives for using data for good policy making and for accountability. There's a number of different issues that tackle, there's a number of other questions that tackle in different ways the issue of data use, but with apologies for those who asked them, I think I'm just going to keep that as the single central point. What is it that this report is going to propose as effective mechanisms for increasing data use? Aidan, I see you also want to come in. I'm going to invite the bank team. We're 8 minutes out, so I'm going to invite the bank team, somebody from the bank team, to come in on this question. Then any of the other panelists who want to come back, please indicate by raising your hand. If we have time, I'll go back to the bank team, but if we don't, I may have to just cut us off then. So, but please, if somebody from the bank team can just come back on this use point and anything remaining to be said on inequality. Thank you.
Hello, this is Vivien. I'd be happy to tackle some of those questions. So first of all, on the data use issue, I think it comes back to this idea of a data ecosystem, right? There's a whole kind of network of different actors that are in the data ecosystem, and we want to make sure that we include in that ecosystem those actors who actually process and use and apply the data. And I think there are a number of important actors there. One is the CSO community itself, which we see as very critical in terms of turning data into accountability through processing data, making sense of it, and then advocacy functions. And we've heard a lot of good examples of that today and on other consultations. We also think that the research community, the think tanks, the universities are another key digester and user of data, and we're exploring institutional mechanisms such as research centers where you go in and use the data for research purposes but not take it out, as ways that you can actually enhance access to data by that community. And I think journalists are another, the press and the media are another very important set of players. So when we talk about the institutional ecosystem for data, we'll be including very much those actors as being critical participants in the process of turning data into value and action. I'd like to go back briefly to the topic of inequality, as you suggested, Claire. I think that, it's really a two-edged sword here, right? Because we can see that the data economy opens up new opportunities to smaller actors, SMEs who can get into markets for the first time through e-commerce platforms, digital credit, maybe reaching new segments of the population, the gig economy, which has many downsides, but might also create opportunities for the first time for people. So on the one hand, those kinds of forces are improving inequality or reducing inequality. At the same time, we've got these tremendous, dynamics towards market concentration in the data platforms themselves. So it's really a two-edged sword, and we need to try and understand what are the regulatory measures that can be put in place to maximize the opportunities while minimizing the risks. I think on the ethics of data collection, it's really around the safeguards that need to be in place, as well as processes of anonymization. So both the technical and legal or rights-based elements need to come together for that protection to take place. But I'd like to finish up maybe going back to the politics topic, which I think has dominated this conversation, and rightly so. And it seems to me that data is power. Data is power both in the political sense and in the economic sense, right? And we've seen ample examples of that. And because data is power, more data, we as a team struggle with this basic idea that the more we can reuse and concentrate data, the higher the potential value, but at the same time, the higher the potential risk. And I think that trade-off will look different in different environments. I think maybe in environments where there's already stronger governance and more checks and balances in the political system, that we can go further on the reuse with less anxiety about the risk, and vice versa. In weaker governance environments, we should be much more nervous, as I think as Aidan put it, about the reuse benefits, given how quickly the risks might escalate. And if you think about it, both in political science and in economics, we have approaches for addressing these concentrations. In politics, we talk about separation of powers. And to me, that's very much in line with what you're calling federation of data. Don't put it all in one hand, but split it up so that no one actor can control everything. And in economics, we talk about contestability, the ability for others to come in and steal market share. And there, I think, mechanisms like data portability are being proposed as potential solutions. So very much, sympathetic to this discussion about politics, and it's an area that we need to enhance in the framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vivien. Data is power. I think that that's something that we should all have posted somewhere very visibly above our desks to remind us every day. Thank you so much. Aidan and Lisa want to come back in that order. Just 1 minute each, please. Thank you, Aidan.
Hi, yes, I'm going to be slightly controversial like Lisa and say, if you post data is power all over the place, you're going to get all of the politicians very interested in how to get their fingers into it and therefore use it for their own, let's find another, data is imagination, data, let's find another word. You put power next to data and you're inviting all kinds of interest from quarters that you may not want to be too interested in looking at it. I just somewhat suggest two things quite quickly. In terms of communicating data, I think that's a very, very important point. But you know what? I wouldn't want to lay this onto the World Bank to do. Claire, that's our job as GPSTD and other partners to do two things. Translate the data into English or Kiswahili or whatever, into language that is accessible, and then to message it so that people can actually make use of it and in their own lives, whether as firms or as households or as individuals. That, I think, is a whole other ecosystem. I agree with Vivien, but I don't think it's for the bank to sort of have a guideline on how to do that. We need to find ways to do it. We just need access to it and reliable access to it. Second thing, in terms of inequality, I can't stress enough the importance of citizen-generated data as well. I'll give you a very concrete example. We've done a COVID-19 survey in Uganda just last month. It highlighted 3 districts where their awareness and understanding was very low. The government of Uganda has asked us to do an enhanced survey in those 3 areas so that it can better able to respond to the needs of that community. But without society access to awareness, reaching the citizens directly to understand what they know, what they don't know about COVID-19, that would not be possible. An NSO or a big government entity would find that kind of insight difficult to get in a timely manner. So again, citizen-generated data is a very important pillar in, I think, reducing any inequality in the data ecosystem. Thanks.
Thank you, Aidan, and point well taken about the very important division of labour here, and I will take on that as an action point for us, absolutely. Unfortunately, we don't have time for anyone else. My deep apologies to Lisa. You've helpfully said if your inputs were going to be about on data use, suggesting that the bank team keep asking for examples of successes and, very importantly, failures also. And making the point about educating young people and seeing this as something that we do need to also pass on to the next generation. Thank you all so much. What a fascinating conversation. Thank you everybody who has been such active users of the Slido. It's incredibly, I can't tell you how helpful it is as a moderator to be able to understand which of the questions that people really want answered. Thank you to the bank team for openness and clarity and incredibly helpful discussion, to all of our brilliant panelists for raising such great and thought-provoking issues. For those who want to feedback more, can I ask you if you want to share any documents or information, please do so by June the 6th. And we can give everybody the email address to do that. And then I understand that the publication date will be in January 2021. So clearly you have a busy 6 months ahead of you. So thank you again. We are going to be all doing this again in a few hours for the benefit of those in the Western Hemisphere who haven't quite got up yet. And thank you particularly to the bank team for getting up so early for this one. That was a really great, a really, really interesting and stimulating discussion. Clearly, if we keep this up, the report is going to be amazing. So thank you all, and really look forward to continuing to engage on this. All the very best to everybody.